One of my favorite musicians, Katie Lang, once said to an audience in her native Canada, "Every single person in this nation has the right to be themselves. Live life. Go team, go." My guest today, Gina Battye, is the CEO and founder of the Psychological Safety Institute that was built with the objective of helping individuals and organizations discover their authentic selves. How did working with adult ex-offenders and bullying inspire Gina to bring authenticity to the workplace? You will learn the answer to this question and much more in today's episode of E3, Engage and Empower with Empathy. Welcome to the show, Gina. It's so nice to have you here. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. I just finished reading your book last night, actually, The Authentic Organization. So a lot of what we'll be talking about today is around the foundations you presented in this really insightful book. I loved how you explain a lot of the theory behind your work, but you also have really strong actions and tools that leaders can use to then bring back to their teams and implement some of the theory and the learnings that you provide in the book. So really informative read. I highly recommend it to all my listeners.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. And before we get into the great content in this book, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your personal story and the journey that you embarked upon in order to get to where you are today. I found it incredibly compelling. So just tell us a little bit about your personal and professional life experiences and how it took you to where you are today and specializing in psychological safety.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, I'll start off by saying I didn't expect to be doing what I'm doing now when I first started out, fresh-faced graduate. So yeah, let's kind of go back. So early in my career, I had two very different encounters with psychological safety that literally shapes everything that I do today. I want to take you back, right? So I want you to imagine this, right? I'm 22 years old, 4 foot 11 inches tall, haven't grown very much since, sadly. And I was working with dangerous criminals. Okay, so my workplace, it was hostile, it was aggressive, it was a nerve-wracking environment, as you can imagine. And my role, I was teaching people who'd been involved in offences related to drugs, alcohol, violence, theft, and sexual offences. From the very first day, my protection, safety, and well-being were taken very seriously by my employer because it had to be, because it could have been a matter of life or death. I was dealing with some quite dangerous people. Now, I vividly remember this being tested to the limit one winter's night back in 2004. It feels like a lifetime ago, actually, when I say that, but yeah, 2004. So I'd finished work and I was walking back to my car. I was followed by a dangerous man, which led to me being stalked for weeks. I literally wasn't able to go anywhere without a probation officer escorting me. So like from the moment I arrived in the car park in the morning, through to going out for lunch, through to leaving on an evening, I always had somebody next to me to make sure I was safe, basically. Thankfully, my employers created a work environment where I was physically, mentally, and psychologically safe, and they put loads of things in place to make sure that was the case all the way through this experience. But interestingly, that experience showed me just how crucial a safe work environment actually is. Now, you can imagine, I'm 22 years old, just come out of university, that kind of work can take its toll on you quite quickly. So 2 years later, I decided to move into teaching adults in the workplace for a college. My word, I can't even tell you what a contrast that was. I didn't feel safe bringing my authentic self to work. And you'll hear me talking about being your authentic self quite a bit in my work in the book and that kind of stuff. But yeah, I didn't feel safe bringing my authentic self to work because at the time, I wasn't out in the workplace to anybody. Nobody knew about my sexuality. And I remember from the very first day, I felt uncomfortable with my manager. She was one of those kind of, how can I describe her? Like, she was a dictator, okay? She was controlling, she was manipulative, she lied, she abused her power. And sadly, I watched her bully my colleagues out of their roles, literally one after the other after the other. I became her next target, where I experienced an intense period of bullying for being gay. And at the time, I didn't report it because I didn't want to out myself to the leadership team and to my colleagues. But somebody gave me a piece of advice, which was to keep a log of everything. So log all the incidents, evidence, all of that kind of stuff. So I did. I kept a log of everything. And I think it was around a year later, it got to the point where I felt enough was enough. I had to report it. It was making me really, really poorly, just sitting on all of this stuff. So I did, I reported it. The result, now people never believe this, but true story, right? My manager was promoted and I was told to not progress the case any further because it would highlight my sexual orientation to my colleagues. At that point, that's when I knew that I had to leave and create something better. I started the Psychological Safety Institute, where I've spent the last 15 years helping organisations build workplaces where people can truly thrive. That's my thing. I want to make sure that people can thrive at work. The Institute, we're global leaders in workplace psychological safety, and over the years we've developed a lot of intellectual property around psychological safety. So you'll hear me talking about the 5 pillars of psychological safety, which incorporates the authentic self process. We've got things like the PSI culture framework, the hierarchy of psychological safety, all of that kind of good stuff. You'll see it all mentioned in the book, actually, in the Authentic Organisation. So yeah, that's kind of my story, my background, where I've come from. And I guess in terms of our mission at the Institute, we want to create work environments where people can thrive. We want to challenge and transform workplace attitudes and outdated cultures. That's the work that we do. And I love it, as you can probably tell.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so powerful that you've taken your personal experience with this. You know what was missing in your previous work environment, and so you were able to build upon that, which is just incredible. When you were talking about your experience working with ex-offenders, it reminded me of my sister, and I don't know what it is about being a recent graduate and ending up in a role that's incredibly difficult. But my sister studied mental health counseling, and her first role out of grad school was working with drug addicts, alcohol addicts. And I remember at one point, because the job was so hard, they actually had talking about psychological safety, I mean, and physical safety, they actually had an emergency button in each of the therapist rooms that they could push if there was an incident that required immediate attention. She was so worried about her physical safety that she was thinking about buying a gun so she could have something with her while she was counseling people. When I was reading about your story in your book, I found it incredibly ironic that you were in this quite dangerous role that could pose, dangers to you physically. But the fact that they had set up such a strong model of psychological safety in that context, and then you move into a completely different context and it's the exact opposite.
Absolutely,
so you would think that experience working with criminals would be the experience that drove you to create the Psychological Safety Institute, but instead it's just in academia working with adults, just doing a normal job.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of bizarre when I think back, actually. But interestingly, I'm not sure that the company that I worked with in the first instance with the stalker situation, I don't think that it was very much of a conscious psychological safety consideration. It was more about how do we keep you safe and how do we look after you. Because back then, psychological safety wasn't a thing. It wasn't talked about. Obviously, it was a thing, but it wasn't as prevalent as it is today in discussions in workplaces. So I think for them, it was more, how do we make sure that this person that we're sending out there into all of these different offices is going to remain safe whilst working on our time? Yeah, they put so much stuff in place that actually, like, I'd go home and talk about it with my mum, and she's like, sorry, they've done what? It really surprised her that they'd gone to the level that they had to make sure that I was safe. And then you walk into somewhere that you would think is absolutely safe, a college environment, an academic environment, totally the opposite. Yeah, no consideration, no measures in place to make sure that everybody did feel safe in their workplace.
That's incredible, because it just goes to show that there's a lot hidden behind the expression "judge a book by its cover." So you were looking at the book cover and thinking, yeah, this should be safe. This is a normal, no ex-offenders. Like this should be the ideal environment for me. But what's underneath the surface is the part that people don't necessarily look at or uncover until you really dig deep.
Absolutely, yeah.
I found it really interesting, your definition of psychological safety. because I've studied a lot on psychological safety in the past year or two, and you specifically mentioned a lot of experts in this area talk about psychological safety as a way to help people feel comfortable experimenting, trying new things, speaking up, which is definitely part of it. But you were saying in your book that we need to dig a little bit more deeply with that definition. So yes, speaking up is important. Being able to experiment and try new things, take risks, also important, and that's part of the equation. But you were saying it goes deeper with living authentically, coming to work with your authentic self. So could you talk about the definition a little bit more and just clarify your definition of psychological safety and how it differs from maybe some of the other standard definitions out there?
Yeah, I mean, great place to start. We always say that psychological safety is an individual's subjective experience of safety, comfort, and confidence within a specific context. So it refers, in essence, to how safe and at ease you feel in different settings. So that might be a physical space, an environment, a situation, or when interacting with other people. So when we talk about psychological safety, there's a few different areas to it, but the kind of key ones really are: do people feel safe to be their authentic self at work? Do they have self-awareness and emotional intelligence to really understand what's going on for them when they walk into a workplace? What are the things that stop them from feeling safe? So that's kind of the first step. We then talk about interpersonal dynamics. So this is where communication, social skills come in. I start with me, right? So I work on my own safety. I know what I need to feel safe when I walk into the workplace. Then I encounter somebody like yourself. Okay, so we're having a one-on-one conversation. How do I make sure that I feel safe in that conversation, but that you feel safe as well? What do we need to be able to make sure that we communicate effectively together? So the second bit is all about that interpersonal dynamics. The third bit then is around, we're going to introduce a team into the equation now. So we are part of a team. We're going to bring in the rest of that team into the conversation. What do we need to do to make sure that that environment is safe for everybody in that team? So not just me and you in a conversation anymore, but the wider team. And there's lots of different considerations that you need to have around those wider team conversations and dynamics. Then imagine that your team has to work with other teams in an organization. So it's no longer just your team working on a project. There's other people involved from across the organization. There's a dynamic there of how do we make sure that everybody that's working on this one project cross-functionally, cross-organizationally feels safe in that environment and to be able to do the work so they can all thrive and produce the work that they need to produce. And then the last part to it is really about the wider organization. So these are things like leadership practices, policies, procedures, decision-making. How do people communicate on a wider scale across the organization? So when we talk about psychological safety, all of that is important. But what we tend to find is that when people first become introduced to psychological safety, they think it is about that they can take interpersonal risks, that they can make mistakes, they can speak up. And there's this whole thing of people saying that it's without fear of judgment or fear of something happening to them. To us, it isn't that. You know, psychological safety is a much bigger concept than that interpersonal risk taking. So yes, you'll see me writing about that in the book. You'll see me talking about that very openly on social media and anywhere that you read my stuff, basically. We're really keen that people understand what psychological safety actually is instead of what they think it is.
No, I appreciate you clarifying that because it was an aha moment for me. Really seeing that definition that expands more broadly beyond just taking risk and feeling safe to speak up. Can you tell us a little bit about the 5 pillars of psychological safety that you reference in your book? And how a leader could maybe, is there a one takeaway or a specific tactic that they could apply for each of those pillars?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. Let me set the context for the 5 pillars though first before I do. So just so people understand how they work and where they fit in. So when we work with an organization on our culture program, we do a lot of work on change management, culture work, that sort of stuff in an organization. So we start by diagnosing the root causes of issues within an organization. We have a diagnostic tool that we call Lux. And basically that pinpoints any toxic hotspots that there might be within the organization. There's 65 targeted questions designed around the 5 pillars of psychological safety. Now, in terms of looks, we collaborated with the University of Cambridge on this to make sure that it's robust, fit for purpose, all of that good stuff. So that's kind of our starting point in an organisation. We roll out what we call our diagnostic phase, where we gather more information. So we use looks, our tool, to gather that information. We also spend time getting to know the organisation. So we use the PSI culture framework that I mentioned earlier to fill in any gaps and add texture to the data from looks. Once these hotspots are diagnosed, we then use the hierarchy of psychological safety to outline the levels of responsibility that organisations have in addressing and cultivating psychological safety. So to put those principles into practice, we roll out the 5 pillars of psychological safety to provide a practical framework. We offer concrete actions and strategies to create and maintain a safe and supportive work environment. So that's like the context of where it fits in. Not many people really understand how it works outside of that. So I thought that would be useful to kind of go through that. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the first 3 of the 5 pillars, which I believe are the most important and where we spend most of our time when we're working with clients through the Institute. Let's start with the components that make up teams. Individuals, right? For teams to be truly connected, individuals need to feel safe to bring their authentic self to work. They need to understand their beliefs, attitudes, values, and behaviours. They need to know what influences their sense of safety in different situations and the factors that stop them from being able to bring their authentic self into interactions with their colleagues. They also need personal accountability and responsibility, a level of emotional intelligence, self-awareness, and they need things like coping mechanisms and resilience. In Pillar 1, which is self, what I will encourage people to think about here in the first instance is what is affecting your performance and behaviour at work. Now that might consist of a few things, right? So unpack that, figure out what's affecting your performance and behaviour at work. Figure out what's going on for you, how that impacts on you and those around you as well, and think about how you can leverage that to help you thrive in the workplace. For some, that might involve a releasing process. So this is where the authentic self process comes in, which is a three-step process. So raise your awareness, release anything that is hindering you, and reconnect to your authentic self. So that's the first pillar, self. Moving on to the second pillar. So next up, individuals need to know how to communicate well, right? So when I say that, I'm talking about, do they know and have all the skills that they need to have a conversation with another person, like one-on-one conversation? Pillar 2 is social. Here, I'm talking about making sure you can communicate a message clearly and in the way that you intend it to be received. The second thing is making sure that you receive messages from other people in the way that they were intended. And the third is getting the most out of your exchange of communication with colleagues. Okay, so that conversational element to it. Interestingly, right, we don't get taught this stuff at school, do we? And I think that's where most of us fall down, right?
That's true.
Yeah, but we expect that people come into the workplace and that they have these skills without actually having any sort of intervention to help them with them. So let me go through a few things here that you need to be thinking about. When you communicate a message, there's a whole host of different things going on, right? So verbal communication cues, non-verbal communication cues, the language that you actually use, the clarity of the message that you're putting out there. Is it clear what you're saying? And then you've got various different methods of transmission. So how are you actually going to transmit that message? What's the different tactics that you're going to use to get that across? And then lastly, and this is the bit that most people don't do, is find out, did the other person actually receive the message in the way that you intended? And that, my friends, is where many communications fall down. Okay? It's the source of so much tension and frustration and anxiety because people don't check that the message has been received in the right way. Now thinking about receiving a message, again, there's loads of things you need to be aware of, such as when you're listening to somebody, think about what affects how you interpret the message. Okay, how do you decode the messages that you're being given? Are you staying present? Are you clarifying what you're hearing? And when you're listening, are you employing non-judgmental, active listening? And again, make sure that you're observing the person's verbal and non-verbal communication cues. They are going to help you to decode the message that is being delivered to you. There's so much stuff going on when we think about communication. It kind of blows your mind a little bit, right?
It does. It really does.
Now, last thing, let's talk about the exchange of communication. So here you need to consider things like, are you responding or are you reacting to what the person is saying? You need to think about code switching. You need to think about, are you being triggered in the moment? Are you able to open a conversation? Are you able to do that small talk kind of stuff? I confess that's not my strong point, but I know it has to happen for conversations to flow. For some people, it's much harder to do than others, but it's something that you need to consider, right? Turn taking skills. Are you any good at that? Some people are rubbish at it. Some people are brilliant at it. Okay. And then how do you close a conversation? Again, people might not have the skills to do that. So to wrap up on the communication bit, individuals need these communication fundamentals, including things like, how do you navigate conversations? How do you active listen? How do you give constructive feedback? How do you deal with conflict in the moment? So all of this stuff is going to help you to master communication in any workplace situation you find yourself in. And if you don't have those skills, you're not going to be performing so well in a team scenario. Now, I know you said to me, give me one thing that people can do, but so many people struggle with different elements of that actually I hope that by telling you all of that, it gets you thinking about some of the things where you might be falling down a little bit and that you need to strengthen.
Reminding me of areas where I need to do some work. I mean, you were talking about providing constructive feedback, dealing with conflict. Those are probably areas where I don't do so well, and could fine tune that a little bit more. And to your point, people don't learn this in school. And we take it for granted how important it is and how messages can be translated the wrong way. The other thing that I thought of too, when you were explaining cross-team communication and exchange, I think about the position I was in my last corporate role, where I was often exchanging with teams in Europe, in South America, in Asia. And there are cultural nuances and communication nuances that are layered on top of that. Things get lost in translation very, very easily. I know there's an expression in Japan that talks about how people read, or they read the air, or so it's like a way of communicating without speaking. So the Japanese are very in tune to reading the room, reading the dynamic, and other cultures don't necessarily do that as a way of communicating.
In the UK, we don't do that. Well, I shouldn't say that. Most places don't do that, I should say. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And bringing the cultural thing in is really important. We work with a lot of multinational corporations. That is one of the biggest areas that we find teams are falling down on, especially when they have teams of people who are located in different countries. So they might not all be in one country. They might be spread out around the world. And yeah, I can't tell you how many times that actually communication is probably one of the biggest downfalls for a lot of organizations. But a lot of that is because people don't have the self-awareness as well. So they don't know when they're being triggered in a conversation. So they'll carry on with that conversation instead of going, hang on a minute, I need to just take my emotion out of this, make sure I've understood what you've said correctly. Are we on the same page? Right, now we can carry on, right? Once you've got rid of all of that tension and whatever's just bubbled up underneath the surface. But we don't do that because we just don't think about it. And this brings me to the point of, we talked about the definition of psychological safety earlier. Can you see now why this isn't just about encouraging people to make mistakes and speak up? And there's so much more to psychological safety than people realize, when you start digging into this stuff.
Absolutely. It's incredibly eye-opening. We talked about the 5 pillars. Clearly, communication is a huge one. The self-awareness piece is really an aha moment for me. Because I think if you don't get yourself in check first and you don't work on that piece first, then the rest might fall apart. And I know you spend a huge part of your book really talking about the self-reflection piece and the self-awareness piece, which I found incredibly helpful because, I think at work, we're moving at such a fast pace. We're going from meeting to meeting. We're having dialogues like this. People are pinging you on Microsoft Teams while you're in a meeting. So it's just, you don't have time to stop yourself and think, am I getting emotional here? Why am I reacting this way? So I think to really teach people how to do that self-check, I mean, that would make a huge impact. At least for me, it would, because I think we're
Yeah.
just moving so quickly. We're reacting all the time with our communication.
Mm.
We're not really thinking about
Mm.
the emotions involved and why we're reacting the way we do.
Absolutely. But a really interesting point here, right, is so I ask a lot of questions on LinkedIn. I like to think that I'm curious. Some people just think I'm nosy, but I think I'm curious, right? So anyway, I digress. So I asked the question to my LinkedIn followers. I paraphrase because I can't remember the exact wording, but I said something along the lines of, what is causing you the most issues currently in your workplace, right? So I gave three different options. People not being their authentic self, communication issues, and some stuff to do with teamwork. Now, interestingly, everybody said that the biggest thing that was causing the issue was teamwork and being able to navigate team dynamics and collaboration. Then when I said, where do you want to spend most of your time? Again, people said in the team dynamics. And I looked at that and I thought, wow, that's so interesting, right? People just want to dive straight in and deal with the issues without actually putting the foundations in place. So from my point of view, you have to start working with yourself. A psychologically safe workplace is one where everybody feels safe to bring their authentic self to work, okay? The responsibility for creating a psychologically safe workplace is on everyone, not just one person. It's on every single person in that organization, because we all create the culture, right?
Yeah.
Yet so many people don't want to do the work on themselves and to just spend that bit of time understanding what affects their performance and behavior at work to then be able to do something about it. They just want to jump straight into the pillar 3, which is collaboration, which I realize I didn't talk through actually. So if you want me to, I can. So yeah, people just want to jump straight in and go on straight into that. How do we deal with creating an environment where the team can thrive instead of making sure that the individuals can thrive first? I find that hugely fascinating.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're basically saying you start with the self,
Mm-hmm.
and then you hone your communication skills, and then that
Yeah,
should lead to strong collaboration. So tell us about
exactly.
that collaboration piece.
Yeah, okay, so pillar 3 is collaboration. So basically we're bringing all of this stuff together now. So yes, you're right, we're starting with the individual elements, we're working on the social and communication elements, and then we're putting ourselves into a group scenario. So there's a few things that you need to be aware of within teams, and I'm guessing most people will hone in on this bit rather than the other two that I talked about earlier, because that's just the nature of us as humans, I guess. So the kind of key points here are: take the time to understand your team's dynamics. So that's things like establishing personal and professional boundaries, learning about each member's work, communication, and celebration preferences. We've all got different preferences, okay? If you find that team dynamics are a little bit off, it could be that actually you're just working different styles, different preferences, maybe stepping on boundaries. Once you establish what they are and understand each person's, that really helps in terms of those team dynamics. Make sure that you organise team discussions as well to share those insights, to help you to navigate differences and leverage the knowledge that you've gained here to create an environment where everyone can thrive and collaborate more effectively. Now, I've already mentioned that organisations tend to want to jump straight into how can we create an environment where teams can thrive, without doing any of the groundwork to make sure that individuals can thrive. So if you want your teams to thrive, you have to start with the individual and make sure they have the communication skills that they need. Now, I haven't mentioned the 4th and 5th pillar, but basically the 4th pillar is curiosity, the 5th is creativity, and these are a scheduled time in your diary for a specific purpose. I won't talk more about that now. If you're interested in that, have a look at the book.
Yeah, I mean, I thought both of those pillars were interesting, and they tend to be the pillars that, at least in my experience, get left out of the daily work environment, because everything else is higher priority. Like, well, we can work on our curiosity later. We can work on innovation and creativity later. That's kind of a nice to have when we have free time. But I like that you really suggested allocating time in the calendar, no more than 90 minutes, and just have those team sessions where that session is dedicated to creativity and sharing ideas and things like that. So things that we shouldn't take for granted, maybe having a team development day where we just focus on development and we're not worried about all the action items and the to-do list that's looming.
Absolutely.
So thank you for providing that foundation on the pillars. I know there's another element that you explain on your website actually that you call the hierarchy of psychological
Mm,
safety, and you map out 8 levels of organizational responsibilities, and it includes not just the internal components but also global dimensions and external dimensions. Could you talk about
mhm.
that a little bit more and what role the organization plays in each dimension?
Yeah, absolutely. So the hierarchy of psychological safety sets out 8 critical organizational responsibilities to cultivate psychological safety. And you're right, yeah, we talk about internal and global dimensions. The first 5 levels delve into internal dimensions, while the final 3 transcend those organizational boundaries. Now, I'm going to specifically talk about the first 5 levels because in an organization, they are the ones that you need to get right first before you start on the external stuff. Okay, so our experience of safety develops across 5 different levels. The first level is individual safety. It starts with you. What do you need to feel safe at work? So, this level is about recognizing and addressing personal needs to show up authentically. And key components include things like intrapersonal awareness, so managing your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, navigating triggers and stress, focusing on authenticity, resilience, and personal responsibility. So, it starts with you, individual safety. Level 2 is interpersonal safety. Now, this one focuses on those one on one interactions, so building open communication and trust in relationships. This level hones in on nurturing psychological safety in one on one interactions, effective communication, and interpersonal skills. The third level is team dynamic safety. And at this level, we look at how team norms, dynamics, and interactions create an inclusive and supportive environment. The focus here is on cultivating a psychologically safe environment where everyone in the team can thrive. So, key elements, I've already kind of mentioned this, are understanding and leveraging those team dynamics. There's other stuff as well, but that's one of the key things. Level 4 is collaboration safety. So, this is where safety expands across teams and departments, and it encourages cross-functional collaboration and breaking down those silos that exist, right? The focus here is on creating an environment conducive to innovation and collaboration. Key elements are things like role clarity, creating safe spaces, active participation, curiosity, and creativity. And then the fifth level, the highest one in the internal dimensions, is organizational safety. So at the highest level, psychological safety is embedded into the organizational culture. The scope of psychological safety is broadened out now to the organizational level. Key elements here include things like leadership styles and commitment, communication channels, reward systems, inclusive policies and initiatives, training, measurement, transparent decision making, continuous improvement, that kind of stuff all tends to fall under organizational safety.
I think the part that fascinated me about the hierarchy is when you get to that final level from an internal perspective and you've embedded it deeply into the organizational culture, how it can then externally impact your community and your surroundings.
Yep.
So we don't actually realize what an impact we're having once we actually embed this in our organizational culture. It's not just internal impact, it actually affects our surroundings. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. Yeah. So, as I said, those are the 5 kind of the internal dimensions. So, the things that organizations need to be aware of. We have got another 3 levels that sit outside of that, and they're the global dimensions. So, yeah, level 6 is external relations safety. So, this one is related to external collaborations. So, things like the work that you do with your clients, stakeholders, partner organizations. How do you create safety when you're working with external people in your organization? Level 7 is community safety. So, how do you now involve the whole community in psychological safety? So, a prime example of this is like imagine Pride Month, for instance. You'll see a lot of organizations going out into local communities to do work with LGBT communities around Pride Month. If they started talking about psychological safety and how do we make sure that when we're having these events that everything is safe for everybody involved, that's when you're extending it out to the community. You might invite them to specific training events that you're putting on or other initiatives that you can do to really start thinking about how to make sure the local community is also safe when they interact with you. Level 8, the final one, is industry and global safety. So this is where we start to have a positive influence on industry dynamics and global contexts. So this level is dedicated to challenging and transforming industry and global workplace attitudes. So we're actively working here to dismantle outdated practices on a much wider scale. So the ultimate objective to all of this really is to establish a global landscape of workplaces and industries that prioritize and cultivate psychological safety, not just internally, but that are having a positive effect on everybody that they come into contact with.
Have you worked with any companies that have mastered all levels of this hierarchy?
Not yet. We're working on it.
Working towards that.
Absolutely. Yeah, interestingly, most organizations come in because they have a specific thing that they want to address. So it tends to be things like, we're not gelling well as a team, or we've got some issues with the leadership team, or we've got specific issues with communication. So when we work with an organization, we roll out our culture program. We start off by figuring out what the issues actually are, and it uncovers a lot more than they actually thought they were. We call them toxic hotspots, but basically we're looking for root causes of issues. So once we've figured out what those issues are, then we start working towards addressing those key areas that have come up. We work on the first 5 levels of the hierarchy first, because we want to make sure that organization is operating well, creating a safe space for everybody that works there, making sure that people thrive. Once that work has taken place, and once we've got to that organization to a good place, then we start thinking about those external relations, that community and that industry and global context. But yeah, it's a work in progress. It's not something that happens overnight, as you can imagine. Culture takes time, culture work takes time. But I can say that there are a lot of organizations out there that are really interested in this and they want to do better. So yeah, the appetite is there.
Well, that's promising. It gives me hope for the future.
Absolutely.
And I think I'll leave it with, thinking back on a conversation I had with someone in the C-suite who I interviewed a while back, who's very passionate about organizational culture. And one of the things I asked him was, how does he see an impact on, how does he see the culture impacting customer relations? And I think what we don't realize is that the strong organizational culture that you build actually positively impacts customer relationships and therefore the revenue that you're bringing into the company, because customers notice when there's a shift in culture.
Absolutely. But so do families as well. So imagine, right, you're working in a workplace, right? You go home and all you've got to say is really negative things. The people around you hear that. They hear that discussion. And then they have a negative idea and start to put together a negative reputation, if you like, of that organization. So yeah, it's not just customers, it's literally everybody that works there is a walking billboard, if you like, for that organization. So if you create a strong, positive workplace culture, those people are going to go home, say nothing but amazing things about it. And that really influences how people engage with your organization and how they talk about your organization.
That's really interesting that you bring that up, because it reminds me of a conversation I had with my 4-year-old recently.
Oh, really?
My husband and I talk about work. I'm building my own business. He's in the corporate environment, and we kind of pick fun at corporate sometimes. Oh, you need to be back in the office now, and all the kind of clinging to the old ways of doing things.
Sure.
That's happening right now. And so kids are sponges. They overhear everything that you were saying as an adult. I think we were looking at a picture of a business person or something. There was a picture in a book or something, and he was like, "Mommy, what's this?" I said, "Well, it's a businessman. He's doing work." And he was kind of frowning, and he was like, "Yeah, all business people are unhappy, aren't they, Mommy?"
Oh,
and I was like, "Oh my God." What?
Oh, bless him.
So yeah, I mean, it just goes to show that, if you're, even if you're just having conversations about work environment in a negative tone at home, it carries on to your children, it carries on to family, it impacts your personal life. So I think when people talk about work-life balance, it makes me smile, because I really think it's more just like life balance in general.
Yeah.
Because work life and personal life are like this.
Absolutely.
We can't deny that. And I think the days of where you go into the office every day and then you leave that at the door and come home to your family and then you don't talk about it, that doesn't happen anymore.
Nah,
It's all
it doesn't.
intertwined.
Absolutely. And just going back to what you mentioned about your little one there. So imagine, right, that your little one thinks that all business people are unhappy. Impressionable age, right? So we all,
Yeah.
as young people, as like little ones, from the age of like 6, 7, that's when your belief system is formed, right? So the more that they hear things like that, the more that they see images that kind of relate to that, that is what they're going to take as their conditioning into adulthood. So your child potentially could walk away from that as an adult thinking, I don't want to be a business person. I want to do my own thing because then I can be happy. So it's interesting that those subtle messages that we give out and the subtle or not so subtle things that we expose them to, it can have such an impact on their future, but also on their belief system, on their attitudes, on their mindset. It can really set people up, and not necessarily in a bad way. For some people, they might walk away from that thinking, yeah, I really don't want to be a business person. Actually, I'll go do my own thing and follow my heart and do this thing and have the best life. But some other people actually could be the best business people and have walked away from that thinking, well, I don't want to do that because I would be so unhappy. And they don't follow their dreams. So social conditioning has such a huge impact on us all. And if we don't address it, if we don't think about it, if we don't work on it, that's when it can negatively impact us in the workplace. And that's why the authentic self process and pillar 1 is so foundational. We have to unpick some of those things that we've carried into adulthood that are no longer serving us.
That is so powerful, Gina, because I think that self-reflection piece is a reminder to all of us that we have carried so much with us from childhood that we don't realize. It's built into our systems. The self-reflection activities that you recommend are a way for us to basically unpack everything that we've carried with us since childhood, which is no small feat, right?
Yeah. Don't expect to do that in a day.
No, absolutely not. But it's you got to start somewhere, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Small steps every day make a huge difference.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this very inspiring conversation today, Gina. It was really nice to talk to you and learn more about your work. And I love the impact that you're making on organizations. And I hope that you can continue to spread that impact in a really positive way.
Bless you. Thank you so much. And thank you for your time. Thank you to everybody listening. Hope you enjoyed it.
Just as a reminder, definitely pick up a copy of Gina's book, The Authentic Organization. It was a really impactful read for me. Gina's website is www.thepsi.global. I subscribe to her psychological safety newsletter, so I encourage you to sign up for that on her website and get some more tips on psychological safety as well. This podcast is designed to help busy business leaders create an inspired and engaged workforce. I am building a community of like-minded leaders and experts who all share the same passion, taking care of people at work. Whether you are a blue-collar worker or a white-collar worker, small business owner or corporate executive, you belong in this community. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. If you know someone who I should interview or should be part of this community, please connect with me on LinkedIn or Instagram. Life is too short. Let's take care of each other at work so that together we can make this world a better place.